Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sheila Ram, and I am the executive editor of the Buffalo News. Thank you for joining us for our discussion about our series, Who Killed the Monsignor? This evening, I'm joined by watchdog reporters Dan Herbeck and Michel, the authors of our Monsignor series, and watchdog editor Mike McAndrew, whose editing and planning was instrumental to bringing this series to light. Without further ado, Dan, Lou, Mike, hello.
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 Good to be here.
Great. So why don't we let's jump in a little bit. Mike, why did the watchdog team investigate this case?
So we investigated this case because it's a very unusual case. There are a lot of homicides in Buffalo, a lot more now than there were in 1966, but there's a lot of homicides, and a percentage of them every year do go unsolved. This case was unique for some other reasons, though. The victim, monsignor-francis-j-oconnor, was a very respected priest in the city, in a city that was where there are and were a lot of Catholics, and he was also the editor of the Buffalo-Diocese's weekly newspaper. And for 56 years, it remained a secret that the police had suspected another priest and a diocese employee and another monsignor of being suspects in the monsignor's murder. So that was pretty different. It's the only case we know of in Western New York where a priest emerged as a suspect in a murder. In addition to that, we were hearing allegations that the Buffalo police had prematurely ended their investigation into this crime and had done so at the request of the Buffalo Diocese. So we decided that was worth looking into.
Okay, great. So was there a tip, or what was it? Was there a tip received that spiked the team's interest in looking at this case?
Well, I could tell you, Sheila, I first heard about this case when I was delivering the Buffalo News at age 11. Mm-hmm. And I used to read the headlines of the paper as I was delivering my papers. And I was a young Catholic boy, and I saw this horrible headline about a priest, a beloved priest, being murdered and found face down in Skajacota Creek. It's always bothered me since then. It's something I've thought of from time to time. Fast forward to the year 2016, I started doing cold case stories for the Buffalo News about old unsolved crimes. And I started getting calls from a retired judge, some retired Buffalo police detectives, and a Catholic church deacon, and other people saying you should be looking into this Monsignor O'Connor murder. It was a terrible crime, and it was never solved, and we believe that the investigation was shut down at the request of Buffalo's bishop. I thought it was worth looking into. I first wrote a story about it in 2018. And then I started getting calls from more sources saying, you guys need to look into this further. Don't stop. So Mike McAndrew asked me last year to really start digging into this. And he assigned Michel to help me. And I was happy to have Lou's help because he's the hardest working reporter I know. So I'm glad we looked into it further. And I can tell you, as we sit here now, we're still looking into it.
Oh, okay. So, all right. So, given that this case was definitely a cold case, what were some of the roadblocks that you found when you started digging into this?
Hi, Sheila.
Hey there.
When Dan wrote the first cold case story on it in 2018, he had received approximately 30 police reports on it. Maki Becker had filed a FOIL for them. She was the police reporter at the time.
That's a
And
freedom of information law request.
yeah, freedom
we
of
call them
information.
FOIL.
Thank
FOILs,
you.
yeah. And so Dan, in talking with some of his sources, was told, oh no, there's a lot more paperwork. So I had been the police reporter over at Buffalo Police Headquarters for 20 years, and I knew a lot of the high-ranking officers. And sometimes the government will cooperate with FOILs, whatever government it is. And at other times, we wound up getting 30 police reports. There was actually over 150. The high-ranking police official that approved the FOIL for the Buffalo News when I filed it, he understood the importance of getting the case out there. He had some resistance, and he said that 57 years has passed. We should be happy that the Buffalo News is wanting to take a look at it. Maybe they'll stir something up. And we hit a treasure trove of information.
Wow, okay. Were there any other roadblocks, Mike?
Yes, there were. Because of the passage of time, an awful lot of the people who had been most closely involved in the investigation, the detectives, the prosecutor, the DA at the time, as well as the suspects, and many of Monsignor O'Connor's closest friends, they had all passed away. And 56 years had passed before we started looking into this, and we couldn't interview those people. And so that was a tremendous roadblock. However, because we had two very hardworking reporters, they were able to find people who had been around back then and did some great interviews. Dan, for instance, he tracked down two nuns in training who in 1966 had been sitting in the chapel waiting for Monsignor O'Connor to perform a mass at a mother house on Main Street, and the Monsignor never showed up. And eventually, they determined that he was missing, and someone called the police. Dan, how did you find those former nuns in training, and what was it like when you called them?
Well, I really lucked out on that one because a good friend of ours, Monica Rowland, whose husband was a great editor here at the News, she read my first story in 2018, and she emailed me and she said, boy, if you ever follow up on this, I know a lady who knew Monsignor O'Connor, and she was in training to be a nun and lived in the same convent house, mother house, where he was the chaplain. So she and her sister, when I reached out to them, were glad that I reached out. They were more than, I don't want to say happy because it was a sad event, but they were more than willing to cooperate and help out with all the memories that they had, because both of them told me that it had bothered them these past 50 plus years, the way this investigation was suddenly shut down. No one was arrested. No one was held accountable for this murder of this priest that they really respected and loved.
And if we hadn't gotten access to the files, we would have never been able to tell the reader that John Lewandowski, a priest, was a suspect, that Robert Armbruster, a journalist who worked for Monsignor O'Connor at the Magnificat, was also a suspect. And then later on, through following other leads, we found out that Monsignor Kelleher, who was not mentioned in any of the police reports, was also suspected of being involved somehow. He was known as the unofficial disciplinarian of the diocese. And Dan has interviewed retired police officers who are elderly, who actually saw Monsignor Kelleher beat up priests, literally beat the daylights out of them for misbehavior rather than face arrest. So a lot of the things that were in that file, even though files were still missing and all of the physical evidence was destroyed, really helped to bring fresh news to this 57-year-old case that nobody ever knew about.
Dan, Lou, I'm curious, how long did it take for you all to investigate this information and begin to write the first part of the series? I've always wanted to ask you guys that question.
Well, we worked on this pretty steadily for a full year before we really got into the writing, and it was a lot of work. A lot of people that you called that just said they didn't remember anything or they didn't want to talk to you, but you keep digging, and ultimately you will usually find some people that can help.
Right. So go ahead,
if I may, with the one box of evidence, which is the police files, we spent about 8 hours one day, three of us, Mike, Dan, and I, over at Buffalo Police Homicide Squad in an interview room, going through it, taking notes, and it just went on and on. You're reading old typewritten reports, and Mike said, "I think we need to go back a second time." So we went back a month later in the research part of it and spent another 8 hours. So and we each assigned ourselves different jobs in going through those files. So we really had to get that in place first to see the lay of the land. And the police who worked on it did a very good, thorough job, but it abruptly ended in April. Every day they were filing reports. And then when it got closer to April, the reports started slowing down. And when Leo Donovan filed a 5 or 7 page report on him and said it is possible that he could have committed this murder. He was out at a home for priests who had problems. The diocese calls it a retreat house, and it may have functioned as that as well. But shortly after Lewandowski's name came up, that's when everything stopped.
I did want to throw out one of the questions that's in the chat now. Someone asked, what happens to all of the physical evidence in this case? Do we know?
We would love to know what happened to the physical evidence in this case, because as far as we've been told, it's all disappeared.
Right.
And it cannot be.
Yeah. In that first 8-hour session where we were going through it, there was a box, like an office style box that you'd put files in with all of the reports. And it said 1 of 2 written on the side in magic marker. And the 2 was crossed out and a 1 was written under it. And that appeared in the series. And, just a little plug here, if you subscribe to buffalonews.com, you'll see a treasure trove, a myriad of different images of the files and that type of material, photos of the Monsignor shaking hands with President Harry Truman. But the commander of the Homicide Bureau, I said, what happened to the physical evidence? I'd like to look at that. And he said, gee, I was told it was destroyed. And he said, I asked the caretaker of the evidence locker, how could that happen? And they said, the caretaker said, well, we had to make room for other cases. And he said, but this was such a big case, such a high profile case. And there is evidence that we know of, evidence, that physical evidence from reading the police files, where if that evidence existed today, it's quite possible DNA could have been extracted from it.
Yeah, that's a shame, because there have been many cases that have been solved decades later through DNA, and it doesn't look like this one will be one of them.
Right. So I want to ask one of the questions that were submitted earlier. This one is for you, Dan. Why did the Buffalo Police Department allow the Catholic Church and the bishop to bully them into dropping the case?
Well, I am sad to say, because I have many good friends who are former police officers, there is a long history of the Buffalo Police covering up things that were done by Catholic priests. And I can tell you that because we know that in the history of the Buffalo Police Department, as far as we can determine, they never ever charged any priest with molesting children. Even though the diocese, the Buffalo Catholic Diocese itself, now says that there's been at least 90 priests or close to 90 priests credibly accused of abusing children. Now, we were told by sources that spoke to the people who ran this investigation that once they got to the point where a priest was a prime suspect, that the Bishop of Buffalo Diocese, Bishop McNulty, asked the Buffalo Police to shut down the investigation, and they did. Keeping in mind that at that time, almost all people in positions of power in the city of Buffalo's government and the police department were all Catholic men. And it's just the way it was. And we believe that this was covered up to spare the diocese from embarrassment.
If I may just add to that,
Sure.
it goes back to the obstacle question, and we did manage to find people who were alive that recalled it. And one of them was an assistant district attorney, and Bill Carey, and he was 85 years old. We interviewed him several times. He said, "I'm 85. I'm not going to be around much longer. I'm going to tell you what the chief of homicide told me, Leo Donovan." He said that Monsignor Kelleher was the person that they were looking at, and that contributed to the shutdown of the investigation. The Monsignor Kelleher was a very highly respected individual in the community, worked at the old working boys home with boys. He was a social worker. He was a professional wrestler at one point. He managed the Golden Gloves. He gave a lot of kids a second chance in life, but he also had this very dark role as the physical disciplinarian for the police, for the diocese and the police department. The rule at the time was if you find a priest that is caught doing something unpriestly, you don't arrest him, you bring him over to the Monsignor's house on Vermont Street on the west side.
And what would he do with them, Lou?
I can tell you that
Let Dan tell you this one.
I've talked to a number of priests that took troubled priests to Monsignor Kelleher, and one of them several of them told me stories very similar to this one. They took him to the Monsignor's door, and the Monsignor opened the door, grabbed the priest, and one officer said he clobbered the priest so hard that he thought he was going to pass out. The priest fell to the floor, and the Monsignor started clobbering this priest. And this officer said that he and his partner had to pull the Monsignor off of this priest. Now, some of these priests were alcoholics who were sent for punishment. Some of them had stolen money. Some of them had done improper things with young children, and some were just gay, and that was frowned upon, and people would be punished if they did those things.
In the circuitous route to finding people who were still around and in a position of authority back then, I found this one other assistant district attorney who worked out in the suburbs as a prosecutor. And he said one night at town court, the Monsignor Kelleher showed up in his Roman collar. And he went up to the prosecutor and he said, this gentleman here who's been charged with drunk driving, he's a good man. Can you let him go? And the assistant district attorney said to him, look, Father, you run the church, we'll run the court. And he was reading from his diary. Some of these prosecutors, these folks, they kept diaries of their career.
So I have another interesting question from the chat. If the higher ups in the police department who decided to end the investigation were still alive, could they be charged criminally with impeding an investigation?
So I'll field that one. So that's an interesting question. I think the answer at this point would be they would have to have proof that they'd committed a crime and that they intended to commit a crime. And what we have right now is some of it is just allegations by people who said they talked to officials, and you'd have to have a witness who's still living who could provide information against them. So it may not be quite as simple as you would think.
Okay. I have another question from the chat. Dan, Lou, were you able to make copies of the Buffalo police files or use your phone to copy reports?
No, not at all. They were very strict about that. They said we could make notes, and we did bring our laptops and we took extensive, direct quotes from the police files, but they wouldn't even let us use the crime scene photos. There were crime scene photos from in the box.
Yeah, just to set the scene a little bit, we were sitting, the three of us, around a table in this little interrogation room where people accused of crimes are often questioned. And it's a little window. There was a tiny window in the door, and that was about it. And the door was closed, and we're in there for like 8 straight hours. And we had our laptops. And I'm a very fast typer, and I was typing as many notes as I could. But when it came time to get copies of the reports, and we did get some, they redacted most of the names before they gave us a copy of the report. I did have in my notes what those names were, and that helped us out quite a bit.
And if I may add to that, the individual, the high-ranking police official who saw the wisdom of making this a highly unusual move and giving us complete access to whatever still existed, said that we had permission to use any names in it that we took from it. So we didn't violate anything, even though one official said, you can't use any names. Well, that just didn't fly, because we had permission to use those names, and it is 57 years later.
A question that was submitted earlier, someone wondered that they said that this series reminded them of the movies Zodiac and Spotlight. So could this reporting be turned into a book or movie?
It is entirely possible. Dan and I have been in contact with somebody out in California who is very highly respected and well known, and he's in fact listening to the chat, right, or participating tonight, and he's listened to all the podcasts, and we'll see what happens. Dan and I wrote a bestseller 20 years ago, Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombing. There's been a screenplay for it. CBS bought it, and then there was 9/11, and it's always a miracle when a true crime story goes to the small or the big screen. So we'll see what happens. Fingers crossed. And the really good thing about it is there'll be more eyes on it, and you never know who might see it and send us an email,
Right.
some information.
Right. a question about the series or the length of the series. Why did we decide to go with 18 parts?
I can answer that. You know, it was quite unusual. I've been a journalist for 42 years now, and I've never been part of an 18-part series before. It's almost unheard of. We did it because this series from start to finish was about 15,000 words, which is the equivalent. If it was a book, it would be the equivalent of a book that's 55 pages. That's a long read. Most people, they don't have time to read that, you know, in 1 bite or 2 bites or even 3 bites. And so we made a conscious decision that we were going to tell this story like an old-fashioned serialized story, where we would have one day and there'd be a little bit of a cliffhanger, and then the next day it would resume. And truthfully, at about 15,000 words and 18 stories, that's roughly an average of 800 words, and even that is longer than most newspaper stories are these days. So while some people, you know, have complained, oh, you made me read this, you know, every day for 18 days, and couldn't you have just boiled it down? We didn't think that that was the best way to tell the story. And frankly, Lou and Dan are pretty good storytellers, and I think they know how to tell a tale.
Okay. So Mike, Dan, Lou, let's talk a little bit about what you learned about the 3 suspects that came up in the series. I don't want to butcher their names, so I'm going to have you guys say them. But let's talk a little bit about, you know, what you learned about each, and then let's talk about who we think did it.
Lou, why don't you take Robert Armbruster to start?
Okay, Robert Armbruster's a very interesting character. He came up here on the invitation of Monsignor O'Connor, who got him a room in a boarding house out in Amherst. And when the police interviewed this young journalist working for the Magnificat, he made an unusual statement. He said that he had romantic feelings for the Monsignor, that they had gone to a cabin out in, I believe it was Java, with a number of other individuals for a long weekend. But he also said to the homicide investigators that he had fantasies about putting an axe in the Monsignor's head, you know, killing him essentially. And so the police took a long look at him, and he eventually, you know, he was kept for hours at headquarters, and we tracked down another colleague of his who worked at the Magnificat, and he had said that these police are trying to hang this murder on me. And he left a day or 2 later, never to return to Buffalo, but he was never totally dismissed as not a suspect.
And when he left here, he went to New Jersey. What did he do there, Lou?
Well, he actually worked at the Newark Star Ledger for 20 years as a copy editor, and he was beloved in the small town in New Jersey near Bergenfield. And it was in Bergenfield. He was known as the mayor of Bergenfield. He helped start a food pantry. He traveled over to the Philippines. He was an expert on Vatican II. He would lecture at seminaries there. A very devoted Catholic and beloved. And when he died, there were something like 3 bishops at the church and the Episcopal bishop, besides the Catholic bishops. And from all we learned from his brother Bob and another Armstrong brother, he led an exemplary life.
And so one of the other suspects was Reverend John Lewandowski. And I'll tell you a little bit about him. while the police were investigating Monsignor O'Connor's murder, they were interviewing people in the neighborhood of Assumption Church, because that's where Reverend Lewandowski had been assigned until about 5 or 6 months before the murder. And people were the Monsignor who was in charge, who was the pastor of that church, told the police that I had to get Lewandowski out of this church because he was out late at night drinking all the time and carousing. And he said that the straw that broke the camel's back was the night that he kept a young teenage boy out all night and returned him home to his family drunk. And so the Monsignor Bagnacchi told the police that he had to call the bishop's office and get Lewandowski yanked out of the church. The police came across a number of boys who said that Lewandowski would grab their privates while wrestling with them, and was talking to them about sex and molesting them, and that he would threaten to kill them if they ever told anybody. And so decades later, once the Child Victims Act came about and people were able to file lawsuits over this thing, over that kind of behavior, 7 different men filed lawsuits against the Buffalo Diocese accusing Reverend Lewandowski of molesting them.
The other suspect whose name came up in our research was Monsignor Franklin Kelleher. And he, back in the 60s and 70s, was absolutely one of the most high-profile, well-known, and very beloved priests in the Buffalo area, because, as Lou mentioned earlier, he ran the Working Boys Home, which was for orphan boys, and he helped a lot of youngsters turn their lives around. He also ran the Golden Gloves boxing program in Buffalo. He used to be known as the Masked Marvel. He was a professional wrestler. We have 2 former professional wrestlers who became priests, who became suspects in this case, which I find very bizarre. But Monsignor Kelleher, he was the Masked Marvel, a well-known professional wrestler. And one night during a wrestling match, somebody pulled his mask off, and everyone knew that that was Monsignor Kelleher. And the bishop at the time made him stop wrestling because he didn't want one of his most well-known priests to be in the wrestling ring. His name came up in the investigation, and we can only surmise that if Kelleher was involved in the homicide, it had to be some kind of disciplinary measure that went too far, because we can't imagine any other reason why Kelleher would want to hurt Monsignor O'Connor. Now, as Lou said earlier, in all the reports we looked at, Monsignor Kelleher's name never came up once. And then I will point out that when we looked at the files, the Buffalo police files, based on the way reports were numbered, there's at least 25 reports missing from the file, even after we got a much bigger file than we got the first time. So if he was a suspect, which I believe he was based on reasonable sources and what they told us, his name must have been in those other reports that were and are missing from the file.
Sheila, if I may, I noticed a question popped up. An individual wanted to know if either Dan or I are Catholic, or were we Catholic? And we've gotten some letters to the editor and such. We don't have we're both devout Catholics. Dan belongs to the choir at his parish. At my parish, I'm a Eucharistic minister. And we're not here to harm the Catholic Church. I asked my pastor, what are the people saying, the parishioners saying? He said, I've had a few come up to me. Why is the Buffalo News digging something up from 57 years ago? And I've told them that, you know, God doesn't care if it was yesterday or 57 years ago. He wants justice for not only the Monsignor, for everyone. And Dan and I, you know, we've written about some mighty dark things. We're probably got about 80 years of reporting, police reporting between us. And if it wasn't for our faith in God and our church, we wouldn't be here right now, because, you know, we've seen a lot. So no grudge against the Catholic Church for anybody who's wondering that.
No grudge against the Catholic Church, but as a Catholic, I'd like to see our diocese and our church run much better than it has been.
And I have a friend who also said to me that he's a devout Catholic, and he tells his children, never let your faith get in the way of the church, because the church is made of human beings. And the best priests I know say, I'm a sinner, not me, referring to themselves. And so I have respect for those people, but the church is made of people who make mistakes. And I've made my share of mistakes too, but never let your faith get in the way. Never let the church get in the way of your faith.
It's a good segue to one of the questions that was in the chat. Do you think there's a different philosophy today in the police department and in the diocese regarding honesty and transparency? You know, what do you think about that?
I don't think that the kind of things that went on back then are going on today. I've interviewed retired detectives, retired police officers who told me that on a number of occasions they would catch priests involved in some kind of criminal behavior, and they had standing orders. These priests are not to be arrested. You are to call the Buffalo-Diocese and they will take care of it. So I do not believe that those orders are in effect now, because I don't think anyone would stand for it today. Too much has come out, and you know, it's because of the news media bringing this out. These things that happened in the past with the Catholic Church, they didn't come out because of police. They didn't come out because of politicians. They came out because of news reporters bringing the story to the public, and especially very brave victims who came forward and told their stories.
Hear, hear.
Another question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Lou.
No, I was just going to say that the Monsignor-O'Connor has one really close living relative. Her name is Sharon Bettini. She lives down south, and that woman's in her 70s, late 70s, and she's still waiting for justice for her uncle, just like other murder victims' families. So there's another obligation we had.
That's another great segue, because one of our questions was, you know, did the family of the late Monsignor follow up with the people in charge, demand that things were kept open, or, you know, they're wondering, you know, how did they press for more after this case?
Yeah. If I may, yeah. Sharon told me she because she doesn't live up here, she is a digital subscriber to the paper and she's followed the whole series. But she told me when she was reading it, she contacted me a few times and she said, you know, Lou, I kept a scrapbook of all the stories written about my uncle then. And because I'm getting up there in years, I've passed it along to my daughters so that they have it as a family record. And I have a stack of papers that I'm going to be sending her. And I'm grateful for her. We are grateful for her cooperation. She gave us some real insights when they got her uncle's car back. It was a brand new 1966 Chevy Impala. It was obvious the police had really gone through it. They cut out huge chunks of the interior that had blood splatter on it. And unfortunately, that's missing today because some of that splatter might have belonged to to the killer or killers, who knows? But we won't be able to get the DNA on that.
Another great question in the chat. At the time, how did the news media respond when the investigation was shut down?
I can
Well,
answer.
yeah, go ahead,
Let
Mike.
me jump in here. So when the Monsignor was first found dead in Skagakwatta Creek, there were daily stories in the Buffalo papers and in the Niagara Falls papers and in papers all across New York State and even across the country, because the Associated Press or the UPI would write a story and it would be carried all over the country. And that continued with a lot of stories for about roughly 2 weeks, until about the time that Reverend Lewandowski was questioned. And then, if I'm remembering exactly, there was one story after that in which police kind of put out a public appeal for help on the case, and for witnesses to come forward, and then it disappeared. And it wasn't written again. We couldn't find any other stories about the case until he was killed March 13th, 1966. And then after about 2 weeks, there was a gap, and there wasn't another story where the case was mentioned until January 1st of 1967. And there was like a roundup of all of the murders that had happened in Buffalo that year. And the Monsignors and one other case were the only unsolved ones. And then it disappeared until Dan wrote about it, as far as we know. We don't think there was another story about it until 2018.
Bottom
And
line,
so-
Sheila, we believe that the news media, all of the Buffalo news media, went along with the cover-up.
Or they may have just, the police may have just stopped telling them about anything about the case as well. We don't know for sure that they knew what was going on.
We do know that they didn't follow up with stories saying
Yes,
whatever
that's
happened
true.
to the O'Connor case,
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
right.
including our paper.
Yep.
So today, could the Erie County DA's office do more to look into this murder and possible cover-up? Should they?
Well, I did interview John Flynn, who
The district attorney.
the district
right?
attorney, who is a
Yeah.
devout Catholic. I've often seen him at Mass, and he said that at this point, unless there's any new information that comes forward, he would not reinvestigate the case. The case, because it's a homicide and it's unsolved, technically remains open. But other lawyers have called me and said that if you open the case or reinvestigate the case, that's how you find new evidence. A lot of times, I think that there should be an accounting of every piece of evidence at Buffalo Police Headquarters. I mean, they have a special locker off campus for the evidence. And I've been told that, well, there was a flood way back when. There's always a flood. The diocese had a flood in its storage, and they don't have all of the material they claim. And maybe there was a flood, but you don't need to have any new evidence to, get a search warrant, request evidence, a subpoena for evidence. I would love to see what is in Monsignor O'Connor's files, Monsignor Kelleher's files, and Father Lewandowski's files. And, just to see what's there. And Bishop McNulty had a personal appointment book that the diocese has. The diocese says there's no mention of him ever meeting with police or anything like that. Yet we have information that Leo Donovan met with McNulty and felt that he wasn't being truthful with him. So an accounting of the evidence that exists, and maybe in some corner of the evidence locker, they'll find that box of physical evidence that had bowling equipment in it, and the blood splatter of the upholstery inside the car, and that could open up doors. I'm not saying that the Buffalo police of today are covering up anything. They weren't around back then. And there was an old boys network back then. And that's why the police official who granted the FOIL to us most recently understood that. He understood that there was an old boys network, and he went against other people when he said, let them look at it. He said, it's 57 years old. This is our best bet at possibly solving it. You know, he didn't have his rose-colored eyeglasses on or anything, but by the Buffalo News looking at it, our readers have learned a lot more about this, and there's some outrage in the community. So why wouldn't we want to have officials taking another look at it? You know, and maybe saying there was no cover-up, or there was a cover-up, or maybe they'll find the physical evidence. I'm sorry for going on.
That's okay. So I'm not sure if you can answer this, Dan or Lou. One of the questions in the chat is, who do you, the reporters, think murdered the Monsignor? Or who do you surmise murdered the Monsignor?
We really can't. I hate to dodge the question, but we really can't answer that, partly because there's so many files that were missing from the Buffalo police case file, and also because so many of the people that were around back then are deceased. We do know that this investigation was focusing on at least one priest, and we believe, based on Bill Carey's comments, two priests. Now, why would they have killed Monsignor O'Connor? The only thing I could guess at is that it was a disciplinary measure that went too far. We do believe that there are people out there in Western New York who know what happened and have not come forward. And we would love to hear from them, because we do think there are people that know the answer to this mystery. And we will keep looking into this, by the way. We're still pursuing a number of very promising leads. If anyone out there knows anyone who was working at Sisters Hospital on the night of March 13th, 1966, please call us, because that one of those people might know the answer to this mystery.
Okay.
We very much would like to see this solved, not because Dan and I want to solve it, for the main reason of justice for the Monsignor and for any other murder victim out there. Dan does this regular feature from time to time, cold cases, and Dan and I are not judges. We try to get at the truth as best we can, and but that isn't our job to judge. There's some incriminating evidence there, and the problem is, as John Flynn, the DA, has said, a lot of these people are deceased now, and you know, John, I believe, is an honorable man, and but I personally feel more could be done, and that is my opinion. And I don't have subpoena power. Dan and I just go knocking on doors and we burn the shoe leather.
Okay. Are there, so we did the 18-part series. Were there any pieces not in the series that you wished could be in there? Mike's laughing at that.
Well, as the editor on the project, I did have to veto a few things because I felt there was a few things we just did not have enough information about to justify publishing them. Those are things that we're still looking at, and I just as soon not divulge a whole lot about that, other than, you know, we are still looking at a few loose ends.
So if readers want to catch up on our series, Who Killed the Monsignor, they can still go to buffalo-news.com to read the series, correct? It is there. I think someone
Yeah,
asked
there's
if there's a podcast as well.
Right. Mhm.
I
Yep.
So yeah, it's on the screen now. So here's how you can read the series and you can subscribe. Also, as Dan and Lou both said, they'd love to hear from anyone who wants to talk about this case or share other ideas. We're always happy to hear about it. Mike, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about, what it takes to bring a project like this from idea to finish. Can you share
Yeah.
a little insight? Yeah.
So one of the challenging things that fell to me was finding photographs and videos to go along with the incredible stories that Dan and Lou were writing. And we were lucky. We found in our old library, which we call the morgue, there's files upon files upon files of old photos going back decades. And I was looking in the file that said Monsignor-Francis-J-Oconnor, and we couldn't find any photos of him in there. And then one day I was in the morgue and I'm poking around trying to find things. And I said, well, let me look at the file called the Magnificat. That was the newspaper that he ran. And lo and behold, there was like 3 or 4 really good photos of the Monsignor. And I cannot tell you how happy I was, because that was really weighing on me. And then in addition, we asked one of the TV stations, Lou, I'm sorry,
WIVB, Channel 4,
WIVB,
WIVB, thank you.
and we asked them if they had any old footage from 1966 of when police were investigating this, and we got 3 videos. One was of the Monsignor's funeral, and there's all these historic photos of nuns with the full habit and walking in lines and the old cars going by, and it was just the coolest. I don't mean to sound awful, but it was a cool video to watch, just because it was so old. And then there was a video of a police one of the police homicide officials giving a news conference, and then there was another one of police at the scene of the crime by the Skajakwita Creek, doing what police do, and they were pretty neat historic pieces of information that helped us tell this story.
I have something that we didn't put in that was really interesting and really shows, I think it shows the connection of what a Catholic town Buffalo was back then. And it was the wife of the chief of detectives, Ralph Dagenhart, who would later become the police commissioner. She actually wrote a letter to Bishop McNulty, who was the bishop at the time of the murder. And she asked the bishop, please pray for my husband, Ralph. He is working so hard to solve this murder. And I just can't imagine something like that happening today. And there was another element. The Monsignor's father was deaf. And Dan,
Yeah.
why don't you talk about that with the inclination of the thought?
A detective put in a report that said that the Monsignor's father believed that the Monsignor had some kind of premonition that something horrible was going to happen to him. And that really jumped out at me when I saw that, because if he did have a premonition, sadly, he was correct.
If can I just add something, Sheila? I just saw
Sure.
an individual with a question. What happens if the Buffalo News ceases to exist to its archives? Well, I got news for you. The Buffalo News is going to be around for a long, long time, as long as folks like you continue to subscribe to our digital product and to our paper product. And because we really perform an important mission. I mean, there's no place else that you're going to see this type of work. And so thanks for asking. And we plan to be here for a long time to come. Thank you.
Well, Lou, I guess I'm not going to try to top that. Only to say thank you all so much for reading the Buffalo News, for reading our series, Who Killed the Monsignor, and for taking the time out tonight to join us. So again, thank you for joining us. We appreciate you being here. Have a wonderful evening.